February 14, 1942. Basement Laboratory, Converse Hall, Harvard University. A faint spark cut through the dim basement air as Professor Louis F. Pfizer touched a flame to a small beaker filled with an unfamiliar, thickened fuel. Instead of evaporating in a sudden burst like ordinary gasoline, the substance gripped the glass and burned with unnerving persistence. The sticky mass refused to drip away or extinguish itself. In his notebook, Pfizer recorded the crucial observation. Aluminum naphthenate combined with aluminum palmitate produced a gelatinous mixture, first soft like fruit puree, later stiffening into a rubbery solid. The 42-year-old chemist, an expert in organic synthesis, placed the match aside and reached for the secure line that connected his lab to military contacts in Washington. He understood immediately that the compound in front of him was more than a curious reaction. It was a chemical tool with the potential to reshape the U.S. campaign across the Pacific. An incendiary capable of creeping into caves, seeping into cracks in fortifications, and overwhelming defensive positions that high-explosive bombs had repeatedly failed to defeat. Pfizer could not yet foresee that the discovery he made on Valentine's Day would become the backbone of the largest incendiary operation ever conducted. By early 1942, American forces had discovered that Japanese defensive doctrine made conventional firepower nearly obsolete. Japanese garrisons refused to capitulate, transforming volcanic rock, coral shelves, and ancient burial chambers into interconnected defensive complexes. Entire islands became networks of tunnels and reinforced shelters. Iwo Jima alone held more than 11 miles of underground passages, all reinforced to absorb artillery. On Okinawa, centuries-old tombs had been fortified and armed with machine guns. Bombs exploded harmlessly on the surface, shells barely chipped the rock, and assaults often required brutal close-quarters combat. The military needed a weapon capable of reaching into these impermeable positions. The solution came not from an armament factory, but from a professor who had been studying synthetic rubber when war erupted. Louis Frederick Pfizer, born in Columbus, Ohio, on April 7, 1909, had made his academic reputation by working on vitamin K synthesis and research into blood clotting mechanisms. Though initially reluctant to join chemical weapons development, particularly projects involving poisonous agents, he eventually agreed to apply his knowledge to the war effort. His decision would link his name permanently to the history of incendiary warfare. The first large-scale test of his gelled fuel took place not in a controlled military testing range, but in the middle of Harvard University's athletic grounds. On July 4, 1942, Independence Day, Pfizer and his assistants carried a 45-pound charge of the new compound to a shallow pool of water on the soccer field between the stadium and the business school. The Cambridge Fire Department waited anxiously at the perimeter, while nearby tennis players continued their games, unaware of what was about to be unleashed. When the white phosphorus igniter fired, the gelled gasoline erupted outward in glowing clumps. Droplets of flaming material landed in the water and continued burning as if oxygen supply meant nothing. Startled tennis players abandoned the courts as the viscous flames clung to everything within reach. No amount of water washed them away. The gel burned at temperatures hovering around 800 to 1200 degrees Celsius, far hotter than what ordinary incendiaries achieved. Calculations from the test indicated that the compound produced heat roughly 6 times more intense than thermite. And unlike normal gasoline, which tended to explode in uncontrolled blossoms of fire, the gel could be directed in narrow targeted streams suitable for bunker apertures, cave entrances, and narrow slit trenches. Early trials with conventional incendiary devices produced very low success rates, roughly one effective strike for every 60 attempts. The gelled fuel, however, delivered measurable results in roughly one-third of engagements. The statistics alone guaranteed further interest, but the underlying chemistry was what truly set the compound apart. It adhered to surfaces, to uniforms, even to bare skin, and continued burning regardless of environmental conditions. Production followed almost immediately. A facility operated by the New England firm Nuerix Products developed a stable brown powder that looked harmless but transformed into gel once mixed with gasoline. By mid-April 1942, orders for mass production arrived from the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service. Dow Chemical scaled up manufacturing, and by 1943, the United States was producing approximately 500,000 units of the new incendiary. By the following year, output had increased to more than 8 million. To deliver the compound effectively from the air, engineers created the M69 incendiary bomb, an optimized device about 6 pounds in weight, carrying jellied gasoline that could scatter in a 15-foot radius after detonation. 38 of these M69s were loaded into each E-46 cluster bomb. Once the bomber released the cluster, it opened at roughly 2,000 feet, dispersing the individual units over wide target zones. Although conceived with the Pacific theater in mind, the first battlefield use of the compound occurred in Europe. In August 1943, during the Allied assault on Sicily, American forces deployed the new incendiaries for the first time. Yet their most consequential role was still ahead, awaiting the brutal island campaigns where Japanese fortifications had resisted everything else the Allies had thrown at them. 22 July 1944, Tinian, Mariana Islands. The Pacific battlefield was about to witness a weapon it had never seen before. Captain Robert Johnson of the U.S. 2nd Marine Division stood on the island's western heights as formations of Army Air Force's fighter bombers approached from the early morning haze. Their bomb racks did not contain the usual fragmentation or demolition ordnance. Instead, the aircraft carried the first shipments of napalm ever deployed in this part of the war, an experimental incendiary compound quietly transported from Hawaii under extreme secrecy. Across the island, Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata's garrison had spent months carving Tinian into an interconnected fortress. Nearly 9,000 soldiers of the 50th Infantry Regiment and supporting units had hollowed networks of firing chambers and living spaces into coral ridges. Every likely avenue of approach was observed by machine guns. Artillery sat concealed behind cliff faces where even days of battleship fire could barely touch them. When the opening wave of incendiaries struck, Marines watching from Saipan, only 6 miles away, saw a spectacle unlike anything produced by high-explosive munitions. Instead of hard concussive blasts, rolling sheets of fire spread outward, clinging to the terrain and surging into defensive openings. The gelatinized fuel flowed into cracks, bunker doors, cave mouths. Japanese troops who had endured uncountable shellings suddenly fled burning positions, their uniforms and equipment igniting as the compound glued itself to everything it touched. Attempts to smother the flames only smeared the burning gel further. Even canteen water caused it to spray outward like molten oil. Corporal James Chen, observing through binoculars, later wrote that Japanese soldiers poured out of fortifications we didn't even know existed, trying to beat the flames into the sand, but the fire refused to die. Within days, Marine units insisted on napalm drops before any substantial ground movement. Positions that previously required hours of bloody assaults were neutralized in minutes. By 1st August, Tinian had fallen. Out of roughly 9,000 Japanese defenders, only 313 remained alive. Success on Tinian accelerated the use of flame weapons elsewhere.
On Saipan, Marine flamethrower teams discovered that the M2, the standard backpack flamethrower, capable of projecting fuel roughly 40 yards, could produce similar devastation at close range. Yet the men carrying the 70-pound tanks suffered horrifying casualties. Once their location was discovered, survival was rare. Navy construction battalions soon modified Sherman tanks to mount ZB-H-1 flame projectors, giving birth to the infamous Zippo tanks. These armored flamethrowers could hurl fire as far as 150 yards while protecting their crews behind steel. 8 of these machines landed with the Marines on Iwo Jima on 19 February 1945. What followed became one of the most terrifying demonstrations of incendiary warfare anywhere in the Pacific. 23 February 1945. Iwo Jima, the volcanic battlefield. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams crawled forward through thick ash, dragging the M2 flamethrower, whose tanks clanged against the rocks with every movement. His unit had been pinned for hours by interlocking fire from reinforced concrete pillboxes. Artillery, ship bombardments, and rifle grenades had all proven useless. Any frontal approach meant near certain death.
Through the billowing smoke, Williams spotted the muzzle of a Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun protruding from a narrow firing port. Rounds ricocheted off the fuel cylinders on his back as he advanced, 20 yards, 15, then 10. At point-blank range, he squeezed the trigger. A torrent of flaming gel blasted through the slit, turning the pillbox into an instant inferno. The temperatures soared so high that the concrete infrastructure itself fractured under thermal shock. Steel rebar twisted like soft wire, and the machine gun barrel glowed red, then white, before collapsing in on itself. Anyone inside perished within seconds. The scene repeated across the island. Fortifications designed to withstand everything the U.S. Navy could deliver now succumbed within moments to a weapon of fire rather than force. Napalm had reshaped the Pacific battlefield permanently. Williams dragged himself toward the next objective, a buried network of firing points linked by cramped tunnels. While examining the exterior, he noticed a narrow ventilation opening, scarcely wider than a man's hand. The barrel of his flamethrower slid into the gap with unsettling precision. When he squeezed the trigger, a pressurized surge of burning gel surged into the hidden corridors. Moments later, Japanese troops burst from concealed exits nearly 50 yards away, enveloped in flames that clung to them and could not be extinguished. Over the course of roughly 4 hours, Williams dismantled 7 major defensive hubs by repeating this method. Positions that had stalled an entire Marine regiment were neutralized by the persistence of one Marine and the terrible effectiveness of his weapon. Williams would later be awarded the Medal of Honor. Yet to him, the decisive factor had been the flamethrower itself, the instrument that made such destruction possible. Kuribayashi's underground stronghold. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander on Iwo Jima, had spent nearly a year transforming the island into a complex system of fortifications. His strategy was brutally straightforward: force the Americans to bleed for every fragment of terrain. His garrison of 21,000 troops carved extensive galleries into the volcanic rock, creating storage chambers, fighting positions, and living quarters capable of withstanding weeks of bombardment. Supplies of ammunition, rations, and water had been meticulously stockpiled for a prolonged defense. Kuribayashi had examined American operations in earlier campaigns and understood that U.S. forces relied heavily on overwhelming artillery and naval firepower. To counter this, he placed his strong points on reverse slopes to protect them from direct shelling and issued strict orders forbidding wasteful banzai attacks.
His attempt was a grinding battle of attrition, fought entirely from fortified interiors. What he had not anticipated was the destructive potential of napalm-based flamethrowers.
Arrival of the flame-equipped Shermans. On the second day of the invasion, modified Shermans, nicknamed Zippo tanks, rolled forward to support the infantry. Captain Frank Caldwell of the 26th Marines observed one advance toward a subterranean installation that had resisted repeated assaults for 48 hours. At a command, the tank released a torrent of flaming petroleum that arced into the cavern entrance and streamed deep into the unseen passages. The thickened fuel spread as if it were liquid metal, infiltrating cracks, side chambers, and dead-end alcoves. According to Caldwell, the entire hillside seemed to sigh out smoke before the cries began. Japanese defenders stumbled from the caves ablaze, their uniforms and skin ignited by the sticky incendiary mixture. Those who escaped the entrances were cut down by Marine rifle fire. Those unable to flee were consumed inside the tunnels. A system that intelligence officers believed would take a week to reduce collapsed in 20 minutes under sustained flame attacks. The demands of flame warfare. The 8 flamethrower tanks committed to Iwo Jima burned through roughly 10,000 gallons of thickened fuel every day. Keeping them functional required constant labor. Support crews such as electrician's mate Joseph Klee and shipfitter J.T. Patterson worked continuously to refuel, rearm, and repair the machines, often while under intermittent enemy fire. Their efforts ensured that the tanks remained active, contributing to the relentless pressure on the Japanese defenses. The psychological shot of these weapons was immediate and profound. Japanese troops who had resisted artillery, grenades, and infantry assaults with grim resolve broke and retreated at the first sight of the flame tanks. Radio intercepts captured frantic messages describing demon fire and dragon tanks, terms that reflected the terror spreading through the defending forces. The human impact inside the tunnels. Private Toshio Yamada, one of the few Japanese survivors of the Iwo Jima garrison, provided an account that echoed through post-war testimonies. We had been taught that dying for the emperor was our highest duty. We were prepared for shrapnel, bullets, and close combat. But the fire was different. It moved through the tunnels like a creature with intent. Nothing stopped it. There was nowhere it could not reach.
For many defenders, the introduction of napalm into enclosed underground spaces marked the moment the battle changed from desperate resistance to unavoidable annihilation. The tunnels that had been engineered as shields became inescapable traps once the flame weapons arrived. By the spring of 1945, napalm had demonstrated such overwhelming battlefield utility that General Curtis LeMay resolved to employ it on a far larger scale. What had begun as a tool for clearing fortified positions and mountain tunnels was now poised to reshape the air war against Japan's cities. His reasoning was blunt. If incendiary gel could scour out caves, then entire urban districts built of wood and paper would be catastrophically vulnerable. On March 9, 1945, at 5:34 p.m. on the island of Guam, the operation that would become known as Meeting House began to unfold. LeMay watched the first B-29 Superfortress lumber down the airstrip, followed closely by hundreds more. In total, 334 bombers were dispatched. Each aircraft carried 40 canisters, and inside each canister were dozens of M69 incendiary units, over 1,000 individual firebombs per plane. Their destination was the capital of Japan. For months, LeMay had struggled with the limitations of high-altitude precision bombing. Strong jet streams over the Japanese home islands diverted aircraft from their targets. Heavy cloud layers concealed industrial sites.
Anti-aircraft defenses remained remarkably accurate even at extreme altitude. The cumulative effect was a campaign that produced little measurable damage. After assuming command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945, he recognized that unless he radically altered tactics, the bombing effort risked strategic irrelevance, and he himself risked dismissal. The logic that pushed him toward an incendiary strategy was grounded in simple mathematics. A single M69 cluster could ignite an area roughly equivalent to a small city block. Tokyo's residential districts, densely packed with combustible construction materials and interwoven with countless cottage industry workshops, presented an ideal environment for firebombing. Where precision bombing could not reliably target dispersed military production, wide-area incendiary attack could annihilate both homes and the small factories embedded within them. LeMay ordered the B-29s stripped of most defensive guns to increase bomb load. He instructed crews to fly at night and at far lower altitudes, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, both to enhance accuracy and to place them below the more lethal layers of Japanese flak. Shortly after midnight on March 10th, the lead Pathfinder aircraft reached Tokyo and dropped incendiaries in a cross-shaped pattern to designate the attack zone, a residential rectangle roughly 3 by 4 miles, home to 750,000 people.
The main bomber stream followed, releasing more than 1,600 tons of incendiaries in overlapping lines designed to form a lattice of flame. Within half an hour, thousands of individual blazes converged into a single self-sustaining inferno. Temperatures near the ground rose to levels comparable to molten metal. The immense heat column generated winds surpassing 100 miles per hour. These winds pulled oxygen out of shelters, fanned the flames, and turned the city into a gigantic furnace. Concrete fractured and spalled, steel warped and liquefied, and parts of the Sumida River evaporated into clouds of steam. Fire Captain Susumu Takahashi wrote his final dispatch at 12:48 a.m., noting that the fires could no longer be checked, the equipment had become ineffective, and the city was essentially being consumed. Tokyo's fire services numbered roughly 8,000 personnel with about 1,000 pieces of equipment. Yet only 3 ladder trucks could reach above 30 feet. Their training had prepared them for isolated blazes or conventional bombing, not for napalm that adhered to buildings, disabled hoses, and transformed water into boiling vapor. By sunrise, approximately 16 square miles of Tokyo had been burned to ash. Estimates of casualties varied. U.S. tallies placed the dead around 87,500, while Japanese accounts suggested a figure exceeding 100,000. More people died that night than in either atomic strike later that year. Roughly 1 million residents were left without homes. Crew members aboard the B-29s witnessed the scale of the destruction even from their low altitudes. Sergeant James Orr, a tail gunner, later recalled that the smell of burning bodies reached the aircraft and that the thermal updrafts were so violent they tossed the 65-ton bomber as if it were weightless. Yet for LeMay, Operation Meeting House was only the first step in a sustained campaign. The following night, March 11th, over 300 B-29s struck Nagoya, destroying the Mitsubishi engine works and the adjacent neighborhoods feeding its labor force. 2 days later, Osaka endured a massive incendiary assault that burned for 3 consecutive days and destroyed key industrial districts. On March 16th, Kobe's shipyards and port facilities were engulfed and reduced to wreckage. Within a span of 10 days, incendiary operations had eliminated more industrial capacity in Japan than 2 years of high-altitude bombing had achieved. The consumption of napalm grew so rapidly that existing U.S. production struggled to keep pace. Additional manufacturing lines were hurriedly established to maintain the tempo of operations. The shift to area firebombing had transformed the air campaign into a systematic effort to dismantle Japan's urban and industrial base, and the pace of destruction only accelerated from that point forward.
By the summer of 1945, U.S. factories were producing incendiary materials at volumes that had no historical comparison. The experience gained on the islands, where American troops learned to pry entrenched defenders from labyrinths of rock and reinforced concrete, was now being scaled into a strategy aimed at the Japanese homeland itself. April 1, 1945. Okinawa, the final proving ground. If the battle for Iwo Jima had been a grim revelation, Okinawa became something far worse. The island, inhabited by roughly 450,000 civilians, stood between two massive armies. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers dug in across nearly every elevation, and 180,000 American troops landing along its shores. Centuries-old burial chambers, coastal cliffs, and terraced hillsides had been systematically transformed into a defensive system of extraordinary depth. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, having studied the failures of Iwo Jima, directed his engineers to dig further, reinforce more heavily, and prepare for incendiary assault. His forces stocked internal pools of water inside caves, carved fire breaks into corridors, and improvised crude shielding from soaked rags and damp earth. These measures slowed but could not neutralize what was coming. For the Okinawa campaign, the U.S. Army's 713th Tank Battalion underwent a radical, unprecedented conversion. The entire unit became a specialized flame tank force. 54 Sherman tanks were outfitted with arson flame projectors capable of hurling streams of burning gel 60 to 80 yards. Navy Chemical Service teams prepared 250,000 gallons of gelled fuel, and every Marine rifle company operated with integrated flamethrower sections. The battle for the steep ridges demonstrated just how dramatically the new incendiary technology had evolved. One ridge in particular, later nicknamed Widge by Marine units, showed the magnitude of the challenge. Japanese engineers had constructed interconnected positions on the reverse slopes, rendering artillery and aerial bombardment ineffective. For 3 days, Marines of the 1st Division pushed forward, attempting to advance a mere 100 yards. Casualties mounted, the line barely moved. On May 14th, a new approach was attempted. Marines dragged heavy drums of the incendiary mixture to the crest. They punctured the metal containers with rifle shots and nudged them down onto the hidden enemy defenses. As the gel oozed through cracks and crevices, white phosphorus grenades ignited the cascading fuel. The ravine became a roaring furnace. Fortifications that had withstood repeated bombardment collapsed in a matter of hours.
Private First Class Eugene Sledge later described what he saw that day. Men burst from openings we had never noticed, their uniforms and skin ablaze. Some made gestures of surrender, but the fire had reached them first. They fell still burning, even after life had left them. The psychological consequences for Okinawan civilians were catastrophic. Japanese authorities had encouraged them to seek refuge in the same caves now targeted by flame tanks. When armored flamethrowers advanced, non-combatants were cornered between death by fire inside the caverns or the risk of being mistaken for enemy fighters outside. On May 30th, Marines came upon a large cave complex near Shuri Castle. Inside were approximately 450 civilians. Lieutenant John Stevens of the 6th Marine Division tried repeatedly to persuade them to surrender. Interpreters shouted assurances, but no one emerged. Eventually, the flame tank crew followed procedure. They issued 3 warnings in Japanese, waited, and received only silence. The crew then engaged the flamethrower, sending a stream of incendiary gel deep into the cavern. Stevens later stated in his official account, "We heard their screams for several minutes, then everything went quiet." When the flames finally died down and troops cautiously moved inside the ruined complex, they discovered that the majority of those who had sought shelter were women and children. The fire had devoured the air long before the flames consumed the structure. Most victims had collapsed from suffocation rather than burns, a small mercy amid the horror.
The U.S. Army's Chemical Weapons Service kept meticulous records of every major use of incendiary weapons. On Okinawa alone, flame-throwing tanks expended nearly 200,000 gallons of thickened petroleum. Deep defensive tunnel systems, fortresses that would have stalled infantry assaults for weeks, were reduced in a matter of hours. Strong points that previously required entire regiments to isolate and destroy were neutralized by just a handful of armored flame vehicles. Yet this efficiency came with catastrophic consequences for Okinawan civilians. Modern estimates attribute at least 20,000 civilian deaths to flame weapons during the battle, though exact numbers remain uncertain due to the scale of destruction.
What had begun as a small experimental unit under Colonel Unmocked grew into a vast, specialized arm of the U.S. military. Hawaiian factories operated without pause, producing flamethrower fuel, armored fittings, and the CBH-1 systems used on Zippo tanks. Training centers churned out hundreds of operators every month. By mid-1945, the United States had transformed a laboratory innovation into an industrial-scale instrument of war. The Pacific conflict had become, in effect, a war of fire. The firestorm from above, summer 1945. During July and August 1945, General Curtis LeMay's B-29 force carried out incendiary operations with a precision more mechanical than human. The target list expanded to include not only major cities, but also regional industrial hubs. 180 Japanese population centers identified as vulnerable to firebombing. By late July, 67 cities had already been struck. Some were nearly erased from the map. Others saw their manufacturing districts destroyed beyond recovery. A typical B-29 could release 40 incendiary cluster units. A mass raid of 300 bombers therefore dropped close to 500,000 individual fire canisters. Each device generated a burning pool roughly 15 feet across, sustaining temperatures high enough to soften steel and melt lightweight alloys. Japanese fire brigades, overwhelmed and under-equipped, no longer had any meaningful response capability. City after city fell victim to the inferno. Fukui lost 60% of its built-up area on July 19th. Matsuyama burned 3/4 of its footprint on July 26th. Tsu was 85% destroyed by July 28th. The destruction followed a grim rhythm. Identify the target, attack it, analyze the results, refine the next mission. Japan's factories lost workers who refused to report for shifts. Railway networks buckled under repeated strikes. Food distribution collapsed as storage depots vanished in pillars of flame. Prince Fumimaro Konoe, former prime minister, recorded the devastation starkly. "The Americans have uncovered our fatal vulnerability. We built our cities from wood and paper, and now they erase them one by one. There is no defense against this fire that behaves almost like a living creature." Japanese attempts at countermeasures were desperate and largely symbolic. Entire neighborhoods were demolished to create fire breaks. Subterranean shelters were carved with multiple chambers and exits. Civilians were issued improvised hoods and cloths treated with primitive flame retardants. Nothing stopped the incendiary gel. It seeped into vents, crevices, and escape routes, turning even protected spaces into death traps. In the final months of the war, Japan faced not just military defeat, but the systematic collapse of its homeland, consumed by an onslaught of petroleum-fed fire from sky and ground alike. Dr. Yoshio Nishi, recognized at the time as Japan's foremost authority in physics, was assigned one of the most difficult scientific tasks of the war, assessing how the nation might counter the new American incendiary compounds. His technical memorandum to Imperial General Headquarters offered no comfort.
He noted that the sticky, incendiary mixture adhered instantly to nearly any surface and, once burning, could not be scraped off or quenched by the equipment available to Japanese forces. Its burn temperature, he warned, surpassed the limits of both standard fortification materials and protective gear. His conclusion bordered on resignation. Unless the U.S. could be prevented from deploying the substance, there was effectively no countermeasure. With air dominance already lost, Japan had no way to ensure such prevention. The date on his final report was August 1, 1945. Planning the invasion. By that time, Allied leaders were already preparing for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands projected to begin in November. Analysts poring over the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa understood that Japan would defend its territory even more fiercely on Kyushu, the first major invasion target. Intelligence summaries estimated more than 10,000 natural and man-made caves, roughly 5,000 reinforced fighting positions, and interconnected tunnel systems spread across the island. Conventional ground assaults against such terrain promised staggering losses. Internal estimates placed American casualties as high as 1 million. In response, U.S. planners envisioned the use of incendiary warfare on a level never before attempted. Their projections called for 75 specialized flame tank battalions, over 4,000 armored vehicles equipped with large-capacity flamethrowers. Chemical warfare units were to accumulate more than 5 million gallons of thickened fuel. At the infantry level, new tables of organization required flamethrower teams to be embedded directly within rifle companies. Air operations would begin with vast B-29 formations conducting rolling firebomb runs to precede the ground invasion. So crucial were these preparations that Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson elevated flame tank production to a status comparable with the Manhattan Project. Industrial plants across the United States were reassigned, retooled, or expanded to meet the demand for incendiary systems. Yet none of these preparations would ever be put to use. The atomic blows and ongoing firebombing. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima killed tens of thousands within moments. While the world reacted with astonishment at the scale of destruction caused by a single weapon, General Curtis LeMay viewed the event through a different lens. His strategic firebombing campaign had already inflicted catastrophic damage on 67 Japanese cities. Tokyo alone had suffered a death toll surpassing that of Hiroshima. While the atomic bomb was unprecedented in its power, LeMay regarded it as one more instrument in a campaign whose composite fire-based raids had cumulatively caused even greater devastation.
3 days later, on August 9, Nagasaki became the second target of atomic attack. That same night, however, 95 B-29s, armed only with conventional incendiaries, struck the industrial city of Yawata. The fires ignited there burned for nearly 48 hours. The bombing continued even as surrender discussions began. On August 14, 2 large bombing groups, 160 aircraft in total, launched another incendiary attack, this time on Kumagaya and Isesaki. Flames from these raids were still visible when Japanese delegates were transmitting proposals for ending the war. The next day, August 15, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation. In his historic broadcast, he referred to a new and most cruel bomb, a clear reference to the atomic weapons. He made no mention, however, of the incendiary bombing campaign that had inflicted more widespread destruction across Japan than any other method. The scale of fire. Later assessments revealed the enormity of the damage. Between March and August of 1945, incendiary operations had erased approximately 180 square miles of urban landscape in 67 cities. Civilian deaths were estimated between 300,000 and 500,000, with nearly 8 million people left without homes. Roughly 40% of Japan's industrial capacity was obliterated. A 1946 report by the National Defense Research Committee documented that American forces had dropped around 40,000 tons of M69 incendiary units over the course of the conflict. Although the war's final moments are often symbolized by the blinding flash of atomic detonation, the Pacific conflict, in practical terms, concluded amid the widespread glow of burning cities, fires that had already reshaped the nation well before the atomic age began. Aftermath and the inventor's reckoning. When the war ended, Professor Louis Pfizer, whose laboratory work at Harvard had initiated the development of napalm, returned to civilian life and academic research. He was honored with the Medal for Merit, the highest U.S. civilian award, for a contribution that military leaders argued had shortened the war and saved the lives of countless American servicemen. Yet, Pfizer's personal reflections on his creation grew increasingly conflicted.
2 decades later, as the Vietnam War intensified, he watched news broadcasts showing villages engulfed in fire and children running in agony from napalm strikes. The footage confronted him with a reality far removed from the original purpose of the compound, which had been designed primarily to neutralize fortified positions and hardened structures, not to be used directly against civil populations. In June 1972, shaken by what he had seen, Pfizer wrote to President Nixon urging the United States to support an international prohibition on napalm. In his letter, he recalled the original intentions behind the research. When we formulated napalm, we were thinking about defenses and strongpoints, not about human targets. His appeal marked a profound shift from the wartime confidence of the 1940s to the moral unease of the later Cold War era. Louis Pfizer later admitted that he had no special claim to pronounce moral judgment on napalm simply because he had created it, yet he maintained a quiet conviction that any use of the substance ought to be tightly limited. When he communicated this view to Edward David Jr., then serving as President Nixon's chief scientific advisor, the response he received was polite but non-committal. David noted that predicting or regulating the battlefield behavior of incendiary mixtures was inherently difficult and promised only that the recommendation would be reviewed. Pfizer interpreted the reply as a diplomatic dismissal. When he died in 1977, Harvard's official remembrance highlighted his contributions to vitamin K and anti-malarial research. His role in producing one of the most consequential weapons of the 20th century went unmentioned. The institution had effectively sanitized his record, leaving napalm in the shadows of his career. By that time, the tactical transformation wrought by incendiary warfare had long been realized. The era in which reinforced bunkers, mountain tunnels, and stone fortifications could guarantee survival had come to an end. No defensive position, no matter how deep or how ingeniously engineered, could withstand burning gel that clung to every surface it touched. Even the cave networks of the Pacific, carved into sheer volcanic rock and defended by troops willing to die in place, succumbed to a weapon devised in an academic laboratory. When the war concluded, the specialized units that had pioneered mechanized flame warfare quickly disappeared. The 713th Tank Battalion was dissolved in 1946, its flame-throwing tanks dismantled and their unique fittings systematically destroyed. The chemical warfare service personnel who had developed these machines returned to civilian professions, and Colonel Anmach's experimental flamethrower group was disbanded, its files sealed from public review for decades. Veterans seldom recounted what they had seen or done. Marine Corporal Raymond Hart, who fought on Iwo Jima, offered only brief reflections, summarized in a single line: "The flamethrowers got it done." Herschel Woody Williams, the final surviving Medal of Honor recipient from that battle, dedicated his later life to supporting Gold Star families and consistently avoided revisiting the weapon that had defined his wartime actions.
Eugene Sledge, in his memoir, described a moral disintegration brought about by such tools. He wrote that although the Japanese could be brutal, introducing flame weapons changed everything. War stripped humanity from all who participated. What emerged with stark clarity after the conflict was the military lesson. Human resolve, however fierce, could not counteract chemical and industrial ingenuity. Napalm symbolized a modern paradigm in which mass production, applied science, and logistical dominance eclipsed the spirit of traditional warrior culture. Japan's centuries-old martial ethos, rooted in notions of sacrifice, honor, and endurance, fell before a petroleum-based compound delivered in steel canisters. The post-war period codified these new realities. Major nations integrated flame and incendiary systems into their arsenals, while international agreements attempted to place boundaries on their use. The 1980 Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons imposed restrictions, but stopped short of an outright prohibition. Ironically, the incendiary created to help bring one global conflict to an end soon appeared in multiple later wars, becoming part of the standard vocabulary of modern combat. The scientific consequences of napalm's development were equally intricate. Work on thickened fuels advanced polymer chemistry and influenced the creation of new materials. The aluminum soap formulations that made gasoline viscous were adapted for industrial and medical applications. Studies of thermal trauma and adhesion contributed to improvements in firefighting equipment and burn treatment. Yet these technological benefits did nothing to resolve the ethical dilemmas posed by incendiary warfare. Unanswered questions continue to haunt the historical narrative. Was the destruction of Tokyo, with its vast civilian toll, an act beyond legal or moral justification? Did the massive casualties in Okinawa meet the standard of military necessity? Could the shortening of the war legitimately offset the human suffering inflicted? Scholars remain divided, and no consensus has emerged. The debates persist because they reach beyond strategy or legality. They confront the uneasy intersection of scientific innovation, military utility, and human cost. And in that intersection, napalm remains one of the most troubling legacies of modern war.
In the decades following the war, Japanese civilians who endured the great urban firestorms organized the Tokyo Air Raid Victims Association, an effort aimed at ensuring that the memories of those nights did not fade into abstraction. Their testimonies, along with thousands of artifacts warped by heat, bent roofing tiles, fused household tools, charred children's lunchboxes, now fill museums in Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and other cities. Exhibits document the nights when smoke-blackened ash drifted through the air like dark snowfall, settling onto shattered neighborhoods as a mute record of what had occurred. By then, the evolution of warfare in the Pacific had run its course. The conflict that had begun with carrier-borne torpedo aircraft at Pearl Harbor concluded with a systematic campaign that burned through cities, bunkers, and underground networks with industrial regularity. Although individual bravery remained timeless, it was increasingly clear that mass production, chemical engineering, and logistical scale, not personal valor, were deciding the fates of nations. Evidence of this transformation still survives. In the caverns of Iwo Jima, dark staining marks the rock where flame weapons licked the walls. On Okinawa, some collapsed cave systems still hold the remains of civilians and soldiers who chose death rather than face the inferno. Tokyo's memorial parks occupy the footprints of entire wards erased over the course of a single night. At the root of this destructive capability lay a deceptively simple equation devised by Professor Louis Pfizer: aluminum naphthenate combined with aluminum palmitate mixed with gasoline. Napalm. With that formula, the logic of warfare shifted from tactics to reaction mechanisms and from battlefield maneuver to industrial throughput. The boundaries of limited conflict vanished. In September 1945, after Japan's surrender, General Curtis LeMay walked through the ruins of the capital. His assessment was blunt and without embellishment. "We scorched and boiled and baked to death more people in Tokyo that night than were killed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. But it was war. They began it, we ended it." His remark captured both the confidence and the ruthless arithmetic that defined the late Pacific campaigns. Despite the global attention later focused on the atomic bombings, it was the methodical firebombing effort fueled by napalm that inflicted the majority of urban destruction and civilian casualties. No other American weapon took more Japanese lives. The Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, concluded that Japan's surrender would likely have occurred by November 1945, even without the atomic attacks or Soviet involvement. The relentless incendiary raids had already crippled Japan's capacity to resist. For those who contributed to the development of incendiary materials, the aftermath carried profound moral weight. Pfizer himself struggled with the implications of his discovery, and he was not alone. Engineers, chemists, and ordnance specialists who had turned theoretical chemistry into an engine of destruction were forced to confront the human consequences of their expertise. The naval construction battalions responsible for modifying flame tanks left almost no personal records, perhaps unwilling to memorialize their role in converting engineering equipment into tools of annihilation.
Among Japanese survivors, the trauma endured for generations. Children who escaped down streets lined with burning bodies often grew up with persistent nightmares. The smell of gasoline could provoke fear decades after the conflict ended. Some lived with scars that altered their daily lives. Others carried invisible wounds that never fully healed. Yet, out of the devastation emerged a transformation no one could have anticipated. The same nation reduced to rubble by firebombing would grow into one of America's closest partners. Cities that had been incinerated became hubs of global trade, culture, and technology. Tokyo, once the site of the most destructive single air raid in human history, rose to become one of the world's most advanced megacities. Within military academies and strategic studies programs around the globe, the Pacific Incendiary Campaign is now examined both as an example of extraordinary operational coordination and as a stark warning about the capacity of total war to erase entire urban landscapes. The coordination of tactical flame weapons with strategic incendiary bombing demonstrated how a single category of armament could be employed on scales ranging from a single fortified position to an entire metropolis. International law eventually attempted to restrain such weapons. The 1980 Protocol on Incendiary Arms placed significant limitations on their use, though it stopped short of a complete ban. Even today, debates continue between legal constraints and claims of military necessity, reflecting unresolved ethical tensions that trace directly back to the ashes of wartime Japan. In modern Japan, the memory of the firebombing carries different meanings depending on who recounts it. For some citizens, the devastation underscores the consequences of militarism and expansionism. For others, it stands as an enduring testament to the ferocity of war itself, a reminder that in the age of industrialized conflict, destruction could arrive not with a single bomb, but with millions of droplets of burning gel drifting down from the night sky. For most people, the destruction remains a profound human tragedy, one that must never be repeated. Every year, fewer survivors of the catastrophic firebombing live to attend the commemorations. In contrast, the American memory of this event is often overshadowed. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki dominate the conversation, while the broader and more sustained campaign of firebombing, which claimed even more lives, often fades into the background as mere footnotes. This selective memory is not without purpose. It is easier to come to terms with the narrative of 2 atomic bombs than to reflect on the brutal and continuous destruction caused by months of firebombing.
In a span of just 3 years, the technology behind napalm evolved from an experimental curiosity to the most devastating conventional weapon in modern warfare. This rapid progression from chemical innovation to wide-scale destruction would leave a permanent scar on history. Today, napalm and its modern variations are still used in military arsenals around the world. Its basic principle remains unchanged: a sticky, burning fuel that adheres to surfaces, consuming everything in its path. Professor Faiza, the man whose laboratory discovery set these events in motion, spent his later years focusing on academic pursuits. With his wife Mary, he wrote chemistry textbooks, avoiding the subject of napalm whenever possible. But despite his silence on the matter, the weight of his creation never left him. In moments of solitude, he reflected on the path his discovery had taken. But such thoughts, he knew, were futile. If it hadn't been him, it would have been someone else. The chemistry was too simple, the military need too urgent, and the industrial capacity too great. Once modern chemistry and modern warfare collided, the weapon was inevitable. The harsh truth exposed by the widespread use of napalm remains unchanged. In total war, human ingenuity has no limits when it comes to creating destruction. The same industrial power that has led to breakthroughs in science, health, and technology can also be harnessed to create weapons of unimaginable devastation. As the last survivors of the Pacific War fade away, their memories slip into history. The physical scars left by the fire may eventually heal, and cities razed to the ground have been rebuilt. Yet the capacity for such annihilation remains ever present. The flames may have been extinguished, but the questions raised by napalm's use continue to smolder. The war ended, but the legacy of destruction embodied in the firebombing raids and the weapon that made them possible endures. The lesson, though uncomfortable, was clear. In the age of total war, victory went to the nation that could produce the most devastating weapons and had the resolve to use them. Japan's seemingly impenetrable defenses, carved into volcanic rock and manned by troops with unwavering resolve, crumbled under the relentless firestorm unleashed by the United States. The so-called Fortress of the Pacific was consumed by flames, and from those smoldering ruins emerged the modern world, a world that would forever carry the shadow of a weapon born in a university laboratory, tested on a soccer field, and ultimately deployed across the Pacific theater, reducing an empire to ashes.